All right, folks, welcome back. This is Kent Lindstrom. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am your host. The next couple podcasts are going to be fantastic. They are fantastic. I already recorded them. But I think you're going to enjoy them. This is Neil Cohen. Hang on. Neil Cohen is, I will say this, a marketing guy, which is the joke. What does a marketing guy do in Silicon Valley? You will see here he's been an executive at a number of companies, advised a whole parcel of other companies. And there's two parts here. The first part, we end up talking about entrepreneurship around the world, which has been a topic near and dear to this podcast. In this case, we talk about entrepreneurship around the world in Mexico City in particular. So this is going to be a podcast where we talk about entrepreneurship in Mexico City. Stay tuned. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for listening to Something Ventured. I'm Kent Lindstrom. All right, welcome. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Neil Cohen. How are you doing?
I'm doing terrific. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm going to try to get through the intro to my podcast and then go through your background, which could take half the podcast. A lot going on here. This is the Something Ventured podcast. In this podcast, I explore this is going to be professional at some point, too, where there's going to be music, and it's going to swell up, and you're going to get a little tear in your eye when I do this, or someone else will do this if I really make it big.
That's beyond my expectations.
Yeah. In this podcast, I explore the reality behind the Silicon Valley headlines as I sit down with the people who are shaping the way we view the world online and beyond. So Neil Cohen is a marketing person. All right.
Yes.
Don't change the dial. Oh, crap. And for those of you under 30, I should probably explain what a dial is, right? Like, there used to be sine waves in radio, and they used to go out through the air, and you used to have to, like...
Back when we used to walk to school barefoot by candlelight.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
Exactly. There used to be dials. So don't delete your don't stick with this. You'll see. This will be good. So Neil has done a heck of a lot of stuff in terms of marketing. We'll talk about that. But and tell me if I get any of this wrong. You'll have to forgive me if I do. But you've been an executive at Sega, Hilton, Arby's, the Zircon Corporation, founded an ad agency that got acquired by Chiat Day.
Yeah.
Have advised on marketing and branding companies that include Sega, Hilton, Arby's, and McDonald's. And those are the big companies. The tech and startup companies are things like Yahoo, Friendster, Pyramid Brewing, Blue Shield, I guess it's not a real small company, and Alibaba. Did I get that about right?
I've gotten a chance to work on all of those, yes.
Oh.
It really, what it's all about is I can't hold a job.
Very good. Clearly. I'm exhausted just reading all that stuff. So you're just back, we were talking before this thing, I thought I'd bring it up. You're just back from Mexico City.
Yeah, it was an amazing trip, Ken. I went down to a place called StartupMexico, acronym SUM, started by a former client of mine, Marcus Dantas. And basically the concept behind that was to create an innovation hub in Mexico City to kind of channel all that entrepreneurial energy that's down there. So they've got a 35,000 square foot facility they're going to be opening up very soon. It's almost three-quarter built right now, and they're kind of semi-moved in. And they've got two classes of entrepreneurs in there, and they've got some VCs that are going to be based there and companies based there. And they've got they're building the ecosystem that is so hard to recreate, like that Silicon Valley experience, so to speak.
And so what do you, we actually talked on the last podcast, which you haven't heard yet, since due to podcasting magic, it hasn't come out yet. Since this is not live radio.
So you weren't going to lie witness news me? So what did you think of it?
Yeah, you're not listening to the podcast. You used to have a license to do radio, like actually get licensed.
Do you really?
Yeah, the FCC used to license you. And now any jackass can have a podcast. It's fabulous. We were talking on the last podcast, if you're listening to these in sequence, about people who are trying to, the last two podcasts actually, about people who are trying to put Silicon Valley magic in a bottle. I think it's not lost on people around the planet that enormous value is being created here in Silicon Valley. You get New York being a little chagrined that they can't seem to come up with a Facebook or Google. And then other countries, Mexico, Singapore, Uruguay, all over the planet, people kind of try to replicate it. And there's some debate about whether you can do that. There's the sort of capital city view of the world that says, hey, this is Rome in the, whatever century that was, and you want to be in Rome if you're, an artist in the.
Well, you've hit on a couple of interesting points. First of all, there's a confluence of events that makes Silicon Valley what it is. I mean, if you got to go back and historically and just look at San Francisco when it started off, it was one of those egalitarian places where it didn't matter what race, religion, color you were. You could be a Jewish entrepreneur, a black entrepreneur, a Mexican entrepreneur, a Chinese entrepreneur. If you were good at it, you did well. And that was, you look at Stanford and Crocker and all those guys. Those were the railroad guys, and they risked it all to bring it all out here. So that culture is inherent in what we do. Yeah. But on the other side, you have to look at other cultures, which, and, I did a conference in the United Kingdom about 10 years ago, and the same thing I talked to the people in Mexico is that there's not a culture that celebrates failure like we do here in Silicon Valley. Yeah. So if you fail in other countries and other cultures, you're pariah status. The laws are not very hospitable to you. Yeah. But here, it's a badge of honor. It's like, oh, you failed 3 times. Yeah. Good. You're not going to make those mistakes again. Let's give you $10 million and see how you do.
And that's been an interesting concept. Again, on the podcast we've talked about, and I can't quite get this right, but Mark Andreessen says something like, it's that we shouldn't celebrate failure. And his point's not that if you fail, you're a loser. It's like you're not. I think the point he's making is people pivot so quickly.
Yes.
It's like Thomas Edison, said, this vacuum in a glass thing is not going to work. I'm going to create a chat app instead. Like he tried like so he failed, but he failed with the first inert gas he used, the second moved through the rest.
But it was still all about making a light bulb.
Exactly.
Certainly, and I think we get the sense that when I say celebrate failure, in other words, it's like if you fail, you're not put in a box and put in a corner and say don't ever come out.
Yeah,
it's
that
like,
guy's got nothing going on.
What did you learn? Can you apply it going forward? And there's lots of reasons for failure. I mean, I was at a startup at auction.com. We did the first one of the first B2B exchanges.
Right.
We were the first people to kind of do auction style for media. Yeah. And we were bleeding edge, not leading edge. Yeah. So sometimes you're just too soon for your time, and then you combine some other factors, and things go away. But if you look today, media exchanges and programmatic buying and all the stuff that we were talking about 13 years ago is the de rigueur standard, especially for online buying.
Yeah, everything old is new again. Yeah. I mean, classically, many of the first movers, even putting aside Friendster, having worked there, that we talk about often on this podcast, the first social network, Powell's, the first online bookstore, Palm, the first device that went in your pocket, and now... of course it's Amazon, of course it's Facebook, and of course it's the iPhone.
Yes.
There's a famous Ben Stein thing, I may have mentioned this before, about why people in California have the entrepreneurial spirit. It's the same thing in Hollywood, right? Like Robert Downey wasn't doing so well for a while.
Right.
Now he's the highest paid actor on the planet, leading a fabulous life. And it was that the people who ended up on the West Coast are the people who... didn't stay in England, and they left and they came across the sea. And then the people who went from, the people in the Midwest are the people who didn't decide to just sit and stay in Boston. And the people in, here got to the West Coast, ran out of space to go. And then, he keeps going with the metaphor, then went up into their imaginations, and that became Silicon Valley in the North. And of course, Hollywood in the South. Right. And so if you believe in that...
So you mean creating real value in the North and make-believe value in the South. Right. Okay, I got that.
Yeah, and I enjoy the movies.
Yes.
And that's another thing. Like there is no other Hollywood, right? There isn't like the there's a Bollywood in India,
which is the only marginal recreation.
Yeah. So what? So what did you see in Mexico City for the entrepreneurs?
Well, what I saw in Mexico City were lots of young people eager to put their energy to work.
Right.
There were some pretty interesting ideas. I talked individually to 8 different startups, right. And one of them, and I don't want to give away too much of their idea because it was, I looked at it and I go like, this is kind of brilliant. Yeah. But it was a social heat mapping app that was really incredibly useful and novel, and we talked about it for a while. Spent some time with him, and he's got something on his hands. So another another person, and it wasn't all tech, although this was an interesting technology where he's figured out a way to make water more soluble. I mean, it was really, really amazing. So, and again, all things being true, it could have significant implications for manufacturing and things along that line.
So that sounds like a little more, a little more atoms than bits, as they say. That sounds a little more real world than maybe some of the things we're doing here.
Right. Well, and they had a little bit of everything in this innovation center. As a matter of fact, at StartupMexico, they were actually building a machine shop. They had one guy who, kind of came out of one of the barrios and self-taught engineer, and he's building these amazing things with wheels and gears, for a hand-powered, kind of innovation. So he built imagine a wheelchair, but you can instantly convert it into a hand-powered, like bicycle.
Oh, really?
Unbelievable. Yeah. With just really, really incredible stuff. And it all came from his imagination, clearly.
Yeah, these things are interesting. I think one of the, maybe one of the things that are going to happen, they have them all over. Ireland has their innovation centers and all that. I think we're waiting for the big hit to come out of one of them before people really believe in them. But, that's not the narrative of Facebook. Facebook wasn't the, Miami, Florida incubator, and Mark Zuckerberg went there and was mentored and created Facebook. Like it's not the actual story of what happened.
Right. Well, if you look at a lot of Silicon Valley stories, it started in the garage, from HP to Apple. So it wasn't, you can't say, it's the environment. I think you have to create an environment. Like here's this guy that I was just talking about, this engineer who didn't have a place to channel his energy. And if you look at countries like Brazil and Mexico and a lot of others, you got a significantly young population, and you have no way to kind of shape and mentor them in a way because they're not used to that, because that's not what their parents did or their parents' parents did, or so on and so forth. And so, what this kind of environment, and by the way, they're doing it all over Mexico. There's a place in Monterrey, and they've got the Monterrey Technology Institute. When I was in Mexico City, I attended Silicon Valley Day. I had to go all the way to Mexico City to attend Silicon Valley Day. Yeah. But interestingly enough, the CEO of Zendesk was there, the CEO of Prezi was there. Yeah. So they understand what's going on down there and the energy and how positive it is.
So do they have a goofy Silicon name for what they're doing? Like, Silicon Prairie in Illinois and Silicon Gulch and something, or what's New York?
Silicon Alley. Silicon Alley. Thank God at this point, no. And Marcus is a good friend of mine. I'll continue to advise him not to do that. Look, it doesn't matter what you call yourself. Get some success. And
maybe part of it too. I mean, there's a couple of things I've observed having been to the ones in Singapore. The Singapore government was actually giving you $4 for every one you spent, as I understand it correctly. And I may be getting this wrong, but I do that all the time. But roughly, you know how Sammy Hagar said he wrote his music? He used to say he listened to other people's music, and he would get the lyrics, like their lyrics wrong, like he wouldn't understand them correctly, and then those would just be his lyrics.
Perfect.
So I do that all the time. I think so. Roughly what I think is that the Singapore government, like you would put $1 million in, and they would put in $4 million, and so you'd have a $5 million project. And actually the first rather big hit that's come out of not Silicon Valley is a thing called Viki. That got acquired by Rakuten for over $100 million. And I think that's what you need as an investor here to really invest in a place like Singapore, Mexico City, Uruguay, wherever, is you need to kind of, you're like, am I going to be the first guy to have $1 billion company? Maybe not.
Well, but you hit on something interesting though, because the economics are very different. Because a $20,000 investment down in Mexico City goes a lot further in many, many ways than a $300,000 angel round here. Yeah. It's just structurally different. And a funny story somebody was just telling me about, and I'm going to recall the same lyrics that you just recalled.
See, right? Once you mentioned how Sammy
in some of these places, just getting the round of funding is considered success, and they'll live off of that funding for 4 years. It's like, okay, we raised a $4 million round.
It's a win. Whereas here we're like,
we just win.
How quickly can we burn that to make $1 billion?
But that's the great thing down in some of these innovation centers. Again, in talking to Marcus down at Startup Mexico, it's like, yeah, we'll put 10K in, and then if they get the right kind of traction, we'll put another 10 or 20K, and then if they're doing well, but the other companies are like, it's like, okay, we'll let them live here, but we're going to start putting our resources and mentors and our network to work on these ones that are the smart ones that are getting traction. And the goal, look, you invest in 120 to 200 companies. The numbers game is that you're going to have 3 to 5 come out of there and have some reasonable success.
Well, and certainly Dave McClure is doing this with his 500 startups. He has investments all over the world. A lot of people, for those of you around the world who listen, we pull back the covers on Silicon Valley a little bit. If that's not too creepy. But the reason a lot of people in Silicon Valley invest in Silicon Valley is a practical matter, which is if they're going to be involved in a company, Reid Hoffman has said this. He's like, look, I'm driving down the 101. I can get a call from somebody and 20 minutes later be standing in their, in their office, as opposed to hopping on a plane to Vancouver or whatever part of the planet is. But now it is the case that people are investing dollars all over the world. And I think you see things, I think the companies that I am most optimistic about outside of Silicon Valley, because I think the game in Silicon Valley is played at such a high level, meaning, man, if you've got an idea for a chat app or a technology, there's 20 of them in Silicon Valley and they're really good. But you're sitting in Singapore, you come up with the seminal observation that people want Korean soap operas translated into Portuguese.
Exactly.
Not really freaking obvious to a 22-year-old in Silicon Valley, but to somebody who's out in the world, they're like, of course this is a big deal. And that becomes Vicky, and hundreds of millions of dollars later, you're basically acquired.
Right.
So.
Well, and I don't think they're trying to duplicate, and so this is the thing, because we're, the American kind of ethnocentric type of thinking is like everybody wants what we have.
Well, I actually do think we're better than everyone else. But I'll just
the exceptional.
I'll just be that guy. Like everyone fears that guy. I'll just say it. Like,
American exceptionalism, sure.
Right, I'm kidding. I like the word.
Right. I know.
We're all brothers and sisters here on Spaceship Earth.
But the truth is, and I teach a class at San Francisco State the other day, and they were talking about, it came up, we're talking about this thing, and they're saying like, well, how come if it's so great down there, everybody wants to come here? And I said, okay, let's talk about fundamental economic, why they're coming here, what they're doing with the money, so on and so forth. But if we get rid of that whole argument, I don't think they're trying to recreate Silicon Valley as much as they want to create their own way to channel energy and ideas and create some type of entrepreneurial culture of their own. And it's never going to be Silicon Valley. You're not going to duplicate that. But you can, like you said in the case of, let's say, Singapore and some others, is provide some infrastructure and mentorship and a channel to take the people who are willing to take that step and put it to work, because that didn't exist very well before.
And I find this really interesting because we've talked about this on the podcast. We've talked about a lot of issues of getting women into tech.
Yes.
And the observation that I've made is that we're doing all these things that are the right things to do, mentors and innovation centers and getting girls to code and things like that, but that don't fit if you actually look at the backstory of where actual successes came from. So we should encourage women to go into technology and all that, for example, but the guys I know who code are not coding because they were pulled aside at a young age and encouraged to code.
Right.
In fact, quite the opposite. They were encouraged to go outside and play frickin' football. To their parents' chagrin, they stayed inside. They read Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
Played Dungeons and Dragons.
Scary.
Built circuit boards. Like that's how that happened. Like that's how, Facebook was a guy thinking of something in his dorm room that needed to happen. It wasn't a guy at the innovation center. So we should do all these things, but it's not actually how it happens.
Right.
And that's why I wonder in Mexico, maybe it's just give people the stuff to play with and see what happens. So,
But think of it from the perspective, and again, I'll go back to this, young engineer building these wheel vehicles. It's like, where would he go and what would he do down there? And he didn't have a place to go. He didn't, nobody to tell him. And it's just the fact of where it is. So I'm not saying that he couldn't have rose up on his own. But the odds are way against it.
Facebook wasn't, and Steve Jobs doesn't say this. Bill Gates says, and Warren Buffett are very libertarians, like, oh, I'm a freaking genius. And Bill Gates himself will say, I didn't do this in Nigeria.
Yes.
I built this company.
Right.
My father, who runs the Gates and Gates law firm in, wherever in Seattle, and my mother, who bought me computer time or whatever the story is, he's like, I started on roughly third base and, was lucky enough to get home. But yeah, it's true around the world. It's certainly more challenging.
Right.
But, maybe some of it, too, is giving people just access to the basic stuff, like the material.
Exactly.
Steve Jobs was chasing after the phone truck to get, see if he could beg a spool of wire from them.
Right. Well, but I think.
By the way, for those of you under 30, there used to be this thing called wire, and it used to carry currents.
But this is an important point that you make, which is, you can't just drag people aside and stick them in an innovation center and hope they do well.
Yeah.
They're sourcing people who have, the people are coming to them because it's, oh my God, a place for me to go now, not that they're getting pushed there. And it's fairly rigorous. They've got to prove their plan. They've got to win a competition to get in there. They've got to go to boot camps and they got to hunker down. But they're happy to do it. So I think it's a little bit of that, which is whether it's that there was no place for them to go. Now there's at least there's now an outlet to channel that energy, and it's very exciting. I got to tell you, I came back last week, and we talked last week right after I came back, and I was buzzing about the whole thing. It was so exciting, and it was a pleasure to be there. Yeah. It really was exciting to kind of see it at that nascent stage.
Yeah. And my thing that I see as I've traveled around the world, but now I take this and I see this in Silicon Valley too, is I think a lot of people don't get the level at which the game is played. Mm-hmm. Like they go, so your average guy from college wouldn't go to Hollywood and say, I think I can be a movie star. Like I think I could be George Clooney. Like most people, there's a few people who keep their fantasies going and do on it being movie stars, but most people in their 20s go, the odds of me being a movie star are not great, or a rock star, whatever it is. Silicon Valley, the odds are about the same. And yet people go, I'm probably the next Mark Zuckerberg, pretty much. So I think sometimes people don't realize the level at which the game is played. Yeah. In Silicon, they think they have a good idea, which is worth zero, and they're going to work really hard, which is worth a nickel, and then, 50,000 things have to happen. And it's really hard and brutal and takes longer than you think. And I think a lot of people, because in Silicon Valley we create these nice little backstories, like, I sit in my dorm room, thought of it, boom, there it was.
Right.
Everyone kind of thinks that's what happens. And of course it's not. It's brutally hard, brutally competitive. And your failure rate, you just think about being, your odds of being a movie star are about the same as your odds of being Mark Zuckerberg. So,
Well, the level of naivete is, I would say, even that much higher, let's say in Mexico. Yeah. And when you talk about, where's the level of the game? And, I'm talking to some of these entrepreneurs and looking at their plans and going like, okay, diamond in the rough, but let's have a conversation here, and about who's your market, who's this product for? Yeah. Do you know about these 7 companies? Yeah. Right. That's one of the misnomers of entrepreneurs everywhere. It's like, nobody else is doing this because a status quo doesn't exist. Yeah. Right. And so that was one of the great value adds that at least I could be there. And it's not like you want to throw buckets of cold water, a different kind of ice bucket challenge, right? The entrepreneurial ice bucket challenge. Your idea sucks. Bucket of ice over your head. But it was more so of a little bit of dose of reality that if you're going to make it and you're serious, you've got to give this a little bit more thought or take it in a slightly different direction or whatever it might be right now, because if you keep going in this direction, gut tells me you're going to run into a whole can of whoop ass.
Well, or be really cynical and play the games that work, which is not to bring everyone down, but like the Alonso brothers, I'll get the name right, but the 2 brothers who basically in Germany have made a career of taking U.S. companies that have become successful, replicating them in the German language because they know they've got 8 months before the company gets their crap together. Yes. And have made a fortune doing that, literally copying. And if you go to Germany, my understanding is you meet people in the entrepreneurial community there. Nobody's saying, "Oh, I've got this new idea." They're like, "I'm building Uber for this, Facebook for this." Or go to China and like say, "Yeah, I'm building Facebook, and I'm friends with the guy who runs the committee that shuts down other companies that want access to our internet." Like that works too. But it's Silicon Valley is a brutal game that we pretend is like a really lovely little thing that it's just played at a higher level, I think, than people imagine, and that's why you get $1 billion when your company succeeds. That's how that works. Like that's
right.
why that works that way.
Well, I mean, that is the brutal nature of it. I mean, people, I think, outside look at these rounds of funding now that are happening right now, like the $50 million, $100 million, $200 million rounds, and I call that like the FU money. You know, it's like where they basically say, okay, we're throwing $200 million at this. You still want to play?
Yeah.
You want to come in with your 150 or 200? Yeah. Come on, let's face off.
Well,
but that's how brass knuckles is.
That's right. Yeah. And that is a technique too. Capital is a weapon, right?
Yeah, suck up the financial oxygen. Yeah, absolutely.
So Uber is the car sharing company you've probably heard of, that raised $1.2 billion. The number 2 player is Lyft. They just raised $250 million. Yeah. The number 3 player, Sidecar, just raised $15 million. Right. And you can't name number 4. I mean, that's right. Like that's the game that we're playing. So. Right. That should bring everybody down.
Yeah,
that's our international segment.
I understand that this podcast is very close to getting a $50 million round. Is that true?
Waiting. I'm still waiting. It was my understanding that I would go into syndication after 10 episodes and be rich.
Yes,
I believe I was misled on how this podcasting thing works. I'm a little bit outraged. All right, so that's it for Something Ventured on Mexico City for this time. If you want to get in touch with any of the people in the Mexico City community, the entrepreneurship community in Mexico City, you can hit me on Twitter at Kent Lind. By the way, I've been criticized for that being a fairly abrupt way to end a podcast. I'll figure something out. I've got people working on it, scores of people working on appropriate music for this podcast. Anyway, thanks for listening. I appreciate it. This has been the Something Ventured podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom.